Well, the epoxy's not quite set up on these tubes that I put, this tube that I put in and out here on this ferret area I did around the fuel filler neck, but it's firmed up now. It's not runny and soft anymore, but it's still tacky. I guess you can still push on it. I've got had some of these 2-inch wide strips of fiberglass cloth. I laid those out this morning on a sheet of plastic out in the sun, and then mixed up some fiberglass resin and just put a thin coat of resin on these, just enough to kind of stiffen them up. And that's worked now. That gives me something that'll kind of hold its shape. They're not filled. The weave still has some roughness in it, some texture to it. And my idea was to glue these down underneath these edges here and form a lip around all of these openings to set those pieces that were cut out of there in. But these are 2 inches wide, and that's a little wider than I need, so I'm going to go ahead and cut these in half and put make 1-inch strips out of them. Now I've gone underneath the lips of all of these, underneath the edge on this top, with some 180 grit sandpaper and sanded it down. I've taken the edge off of it, the rough stuff, or roughed it up a little bit with the 180 and took some of the dirt off. I'm going to go ahead and cut these in half and then mix up some resin and glue those up on the underside here. I got my first little strip glued up here on this long piece. What I did was I mixed up the fiberglass resin with some of the silica, the lightweight stuff. I didn't put a whole lot in it, just a little filler more or less. And then I put it on half of one of these strips. I put the strip on top of a piece of aluminum, this is scrap aluminum that I got out of the scrap bin, and I wrapped it with some saran wrap, Glad wrap is what it is, so it wouldn't stick. And then I'd put those pieces of fiberglass tape on top of that, put the resin on it, and then stick it underneath where it goes and hold it on with these spring clamps until it sets up. This will give it something to bond to after I put them back on. I put those other flanges in, the ones that I didn't get in the first time, and then I let it sit out in the sunshine for a while and brought it in here and let it cure some more in here in the shop after the sun went down. I just came out, started working on it again. I had to grind out a little bit of the flow out of the epoxy resin that came out into the joints on here on those little flanges that I screwed on or glued on. Anyway, I got those all cleaned up and washed out or cleaned out the inside of the tank, and then I got these plugs that I cut out before that fit in those openings, and I trued those up. Some places they were pretty deep with epoxy on there where it met this flange right here that goes around the perimeter of this tank. That stuff was down pretty deep. I had to trim that up flush so these things would fit down in there flush. And I mixed up some more epoxy, and I mixed in some colloidal silica in with it. I left it kind of a loose mix, which was pretty similar to what I put on the tapes when I put them in to make the flanges. Anyway, I mixed that in so that it would come up and spread it out around the tapes and around this edge, so it would come up around these edge and seal these seams. And then because there's some spring in these pieces that I cut out of there, they don't exactly fit flush down in there, so I put some weight on it and got it held down tight against those flanges that I glued in before, and they're pretty much flush with the top of this tank. So we'll let that set up overnight, and then I think I'll get some 2-inch tape and tape over the top of each one of these seams here, close that in. I still have to do something with this hole here, but that gives me access to put the standpipe in when I get ready to put it back together. So I'm going to wait to do that until I get ready to put that standpipe in. And I don't really want to put that in right away because that fitting is going to stick up proud above this bottom, and it's a good chance it'll get knocked off or damaged if it's banging around here too much before I get ready to put it on. Well, these panels that I cut out are glued back in there, and I think they turned out pretty good. Everything's supported real nice. It's all good and tight. So I've got all the splooge all sanded off of it, all the high spots and stuff where it squirted out when it pooched out when I squeezed it down in there. That's all sanded down, and I've got a rim sanded down around the perimeter all of this. So I'm still going to go over this with, well, I'll fill these up with some filler in these cavities in here and bring that all up so it's all good and solid and tight and glued in there good. And I'm going to go over it with just a piece of tape around there, epoxy that down. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over and take the sander, the little palm sander, and start sanding it down and smoothing it out and get that yellow paint off of there. Then I'm going to see where I can do from there. I identify any spots that may need any filler or any other repair work in case there's any other stuff there that's hidden underneath the paint that I didn't see. And we'll get that all that paint stripped off there so I can put a new coat of paint on it. I worked on this tank most of the day, sanding on it with that palm sander, trying to get all of the old yellow paint off and the gel coat smoothed down where I had some gouges in it and stuff. I got it about 2/3 done, and then I kind of quit for the day. I come back out tonight and I've mixed up some putty, some of the epoxy with some of the silica, and made a putty out of it and filled in some of the holes and stuff. I filled in these gaps that were left in these plugs that I put in, especially on this side here. And then I turned it over and worked on some little divots and stuff that were on the underside in the pocket where these tubes go through, and down there around where that quick drain is. Well, then I tipped it over here and cut some strips and got them epoxied down here now on these access panels that I'd cut out, so that should glue those in pretty good. I'd filled in all the gaps and stuff with the putty, and then I just put epoxy and fiberglass tape down on all of the seams there and got them boxed in pretty good. So we'll let those cure overnight, and then I'll continue scraping off the paint off the rest of it tomorrow and kind of polishing this up and getting it all smoothed out and ready for a fresh coat of paint. I'm all done with the fiberglass work on this fuel tank now until I put the standpipe in for the section for the fuel. Then once I get that put in, then I'll put this piece over here that goes over that handhole there. But everything else is done. Got the tubes in here for the flying wires, for the float plane cross wires. Those are in there pretty good. And the filler neck, that's in there good and tight. That turned out real good. And I've got my drain pipe here. That goes in right there. That's nice and flush right there. That's kind of in the, almost perfectly in the low spot. And then my covers here over where I cut out those that top to get access down in there. I've got the tape. I just took a piece of 4-inch tape and cut it in half and run 2-inch tape around all these seams here. I've made some filler and filled in the gaps in here that were left over from when I first glued them in the places that had gaps in them. And then I mixed up some resin and just put on there and glued those down, so those look really good now. There's the drain, the bushing for the quick drain. I finished filling the divots and stuff in here, and I got those all polished up. Looks pretty nice. I went over the whole thing with the palm sander with either 120 or 180 grit sandpaper, depending on what I had in hand there. It was a combination of both, and got all of the old paint off. There was the Durethane paint that was sprayed on by Cub Crafters, and then there was a coat of Del Star, the same color that I sprayed on when I had this off once before, and there was some gouges and stuff in there that went down into the gel coat. I got those all cleaned up, and I think I'll just take the white primer and paint this. Like I said, I went over it all with a palm sander with 180 and 120 grit paper to get all of the old yellow off of it, and then I went over it by hand with some 220 to smooth it down and fair in the places that I couldn't get with the palm sander. These sight glasses here, I tried cleaning those up on the inside when I had everything off of it, but it didn't clean up very well on the inside anyway. It's not a whole lot you can do with it. They use a heavy weave fabric, and there's dimples all over in there from the fiberglass and the resin, and if you sand those all out, then you get down into the glass itself, and you really don't want to do that. Here I'd gone over this, of course, with 180 and 120 grit sandpaper to get all this paint off of here. I went over these sight glasses with some 400 wet or dry, and I took some 600 wet or dry on there. And after I paint it, I might try to touch that up a little bit with some buffing compound, some polishing compound or something on the machine. So I'm done with fiberglassing now for a while. I'll put all the resin and everything away and get my bench cleaned back up. Enough time has gone by now that I can start painting the controls. It's been over a week now. That fuselage should be pretty much gassed off now, and the controls definitely. So I'll start putting the finish paint on those.